Before we begin with the life of Cuauhtemoc, I'd like to preface this with a bit of details about my research. You see, it was initially difficult to find information on him, mostly due to his name. If you looked it up in Google today, you would see it like this. However, this hasn't exactly always been the case. In Cora Walker's biography of him, written in 1934, she spells his name as Cuauhtemoc, without a C at the end. In Miguel Leon Portilla's book entitled Broken Spears, he spells his name with a Q. Finally, in Bernal Diaz del Castillo's journal of the Conquest of New Spain, he pronounces it as Cuauhtemoc with a G. So you might be asking yourself, what's with all the differences? Well, partly, it can be attributed to language. However, there's a deeper issue here. When Cuauhtemoc is remembered, it isn't necessarily by a factual account of his life, but more as a mythological figure that's important to Mexican nationalism and culture. So the question becomes, who exactly was he, and why is he important? We don't know a lot about Cuauhtemoc's early life. His birth was estimated to be around the mid-1490s, but the exact date is anyone's guess. We do know, however, that he was of the nobility, because he was the son of an emperor named Cuauhtemoc. He also attended an elite military school for the upper class called Cuauhtemoc, after which, in 1515, he was named the Eagle Ruler of Tlatelolco. 5 years later, in 1520, Cuauhtemoc was elected Emperor of Tenochtitlan, the capital city of the Aztec Empire. Unfortunately, he inherited a vast number of issues. After Moctezuma II died, his brother Cuitlahuac took over as head of the empire. He tried to build an army to mount a resistance against the Spanish, but there was a major problem. Many of the cities that Tenochtitlan ruled over either deserted or switched allegiances. The city was completely isolated, and to top things off, Cuitlahuac died of smallpox shortly after his ascension. By the time Cuauhtemoc came to power, his people were grasping at straws. Even though it seemed that all hope was lost, Cuauhtemoc decided to mount one last stand. He called out for help in every direction, but only one place responded: Tlatelolco, the city where he first came to power. They fought valiantly for 80 days against the Spanish, but they were no match. Cuauhtemoc eventually fled, but he was captured when trying to cross Lake Texcoco. He was brought to Hernan Cortez and officially surrendered on August 13, 1521. According to the Spanish, Cuauhtemoc asked Cortez to kill him where he stood, but Cortez responded with altruism. "You have defended your capital like a brave warrior," he says. "A Spaniard knows how to respect valor, even in an enemy." Now that Cuauhtemoc was in chains, Cortez was on the hunt to claim treasures of jewels and gold. He would be merciful as long as the Aztecs gave him what he wanted. When Cortez didn't find what he was looking for, though, he became desperate. They took Cuauhtemoc and tortured him with fire by burning the soles of his feet. Eventually, some gold was recovered by the Spaniards, but it was nowhere near what they were expecting. Now, this next part gets a little muddy. In regards to his execution, there are discrepancies about the event itself. Let's start with what we believe to be the facts. After his torture, Cuauhtemoc still held his position in the city, but he had no real power. Essentially, he was a proxy ruler under Spanish control. In 1525, Cortez went on an expedition to Honduras. Like many leaders leaving their new claimed land, he feared an uprising by the indigenous people. His solution was to take Cuauhtemoc and a few others with him while he was gone. At this point, the lines between fact and fiction begin to blur. There are 3 accounts of Cuauhtemoc's execution, and all of them contain a variety of truths and contradictions. Let's start with the first one, Cortez himself. On the way to Honduras, he received word from a citizen in Tenochtitlan that Cuauhtemoc and 2 others were plotting his assassination. A confession was tortured out of them, and Cuauhtemoc, along with his 2 other co-conspirators, were hanged. This testimony is supported by historian Francisco López de Gómara, but it's fair to say that he was slightly biased, considering he lived and worked in Spain during the life of Cortes. He also has been accused of embellishing the accomplishments of Cortes, as well as inaccurately reporting other events. This brings us to our second account, Bernal Díaz del Castillo. Castillo was a soldier serving under Cortes in the Spanish army. He famously recorded his experiences in the previously mentioned book, The True History of the Conquest of New Spain. Castillo seemed to garner sympathy for Cuauhtemoc, and said that his execution was based on no evidence whatsoever. The whole thing was contrived in order to depose of a man that had constantly given them issues. It's not too far-fetched of an idea to believe, as Cuauhtemoc's death certainly would have made things easier for the Spaniards. Castillo would actually later go on to assert that Cortes even suffered from insomnia due to the guilt that he carried for wrongly executing Cuauhtemoc. The final testimony comes from Fernando de Alva Cortés Ixtlilxochitl, a descendant of previous Aztec emperors. He was the great-great-grandson of Cuitláhuac and lived in the 16th century after the conquest of Tenochtitlan. He also backs up the claim that Cortés fabricated the story of a plot to kill him and used it to execute Cuauhtemoc and the others. It is worth noting that his information about the event came from an oral tradition passed down from generation to generation, so it's hard to gauge how accurate the story is. Now the question becomes, who's telling the truth? Well, each has their own bias, but I'd be willing to put my money on Castillo simply due to the fact that he has the least motivation to lie. As a Spanish soldier, it would have been easy for him to support his leader's account, but he didn't. Whether or not Cortés actually felt guilty about the death of Cuauhtemoc is a separate issue entirely. Regardless, his execution stands as a landmark in Mexican history. This is shown when, over 400 years after his death, Cuauhtemoc's importance came rushing back to the surface when a woman named Eulalia Guzman made a startling discovery. In the southwestern region of Mexico, there lies a state called Guerrero. Within that, there's a small village in the mountains called Ixcoteopan. It was mostly insignificant and remote until 1949, when documents surfaced regarding the location of Cuauhtemoc's bones. This was cause for celebration, as he had been hailed as a hero and martyr for centuries in Mexico. A group of archaeologists, including Eulalia Guzman, started digging under the altar of a local church when they suddenly found the remains of what they believed to be Cuauhtemoc. Shortly afterwards, they were examined by the Instituto Nacional de Antropología y Historia, or INAH, and it was confirmed. After all these years, they had finally found him. Unfortunately, there was a slight problem. They didn't. When another group of experts at the same organization took a closer look, they deemed it to be a forgery. In reality, it was merely a collection of different bones mangled together from various deceased individuals, not to mention the fact that this village was 1,000 miles from where he had been executed. This outraged political groups such as the Indigenistas and other nationalists who refused to believe that they were fake. Some even went so far as to suggest that the archaeologists who declared the bones to be fabricated should be put to death as traitors. Things got ugly fast, and people began to ask themselves, how could this happen? Well, many pointed their fingers toward a man named Florentino Juarez. He was a late 19th century resident of Ixcoteopan and claimed to be the heir to a secret village tradition that stretched back to the 16th century and recorded the fate of Cuauhtemoc's bones. His elaborate account made its way into the hands of his grandson, Salvador Rodriguez Juarez, who was responsible for revealing the supposed burial site of Cuauhtemoc. It was all a self-aggrandizing stunt in order to enhance the reputation of Ixcoteopan and had no basis in historical fact, but that didn't stop people like Eulalia Guzman from buying into it. Even though the reaction to this entire event can almost seem comedic in its ridiculous responses and propaganda, it certainly was a serious and controversial moment for many Mexican citizens. In order to understand why this wasn't taken lightly, you need to understand how important Cuauhtemocc is in Mexican culture. There are many places throughout the country that honor his memory, including a monument on the Paseo de la Reforma and a bust in Mexico City. He has his name on the Dos Equis beer logo, and he's been used on banknotes, appears in modern art and music. Cuauhtemoc Station is a stop on the Mexican City Metro, and he's even been used in video games. So, what does all of this tell us? Over the years, his image has become something that transcended his life. His name represents the embodiment of the indigenous Mexican people, and it has become synonymous with resistance and rebellion. Cuauhtemoc became more than a person. He became an idea that, according to some, needs to be protected at all costs.